Hello everyone, welcome back to part 7 of the age of industrialization. In the previous video lesson, we discussed about the industrialization in colonies, India. We discussed about how Indian trade was quite flourished. Now we'll talk about Manchester, which was the industrial or the first industrial town of England, how the Manchester products came to India. The topic is Manchester comes to India. So how Manchester products came to India and how it affected Indian trade. That's what we'll discuss. So today we'll discuss the topic Manchester comes to India. Of course, Manchester city did not come to India. The products of Manchester came to India and it affected the whole trade in India. We'll discuss about this. So from today's video lesson, we'll analyze how Manchester captured the Indian market. Now guys, we have the source to interpret. The source C from where we have got these information about Manchester. This is one of the source. So we can see here the Commissioner of Patna wrote, it appears that 20 years ago a brisk trade was carried on in the manufacture of cloth at Jahanabad and Bihar, which has in the former place entirely ceased, while in the latter the amount of manufacture is very limited in consequence of the cheap and durable goods from Manchester with which the native manufacturers are unable to compete. It has been quoted in J. Krishnamurthy's Deindustrialization in Gangetic Bihar during the 19th century. The Indian Economic and Social History Review, which was published in 1985. So it's based on the research work done by J. Krishnamurthy, and he has clearly mentioned that the Commissioner of Patna gave the information that 20 years ago, like in the contemporary period, he is saying that a brisk trade was carried on in the manufacture of cloth at Jahanabad and Bihar. It's like Bihar Sharif. So in these locations, a brisk trade, a trade was available, and the weaving work was quite flourished. However, latter the after some time, the amount of manufacture is very limited. So previously they were manufacturing to a great extent, but the manufacturing dipped down because of the cheap durable goods from Manchester. So the products, the clothes that started coming to India disturbed the native manufacturers, the manufacturers of these locations, and since these manufacturers were unable to compete with the durable and cheap products coming from Manchester, because any which ways, if something is produced by hand, the price would go high. Even today, if you go and purchase something like handloom products, they are expensive, of course, because they are intricately designed, they are specifically designed. That's what we have seen when we studied about hand labor and steam power in England. So similar thing happened. So very simply, from this source we understand that there was proper trade available in India and specifically in the Bihar region. However, unfortunately, because of the products coming from Manchester, the producers here were affected badly because people preferred to purchase cheap products coming from Manchester, and they were durable also. Now we have another source to analyze, to get information from, that is source D, reporting on the Koshtis, a community of weavers, the census report of central provinces. And when we talk about central provinces, that is today is Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh. The Koshtis, like the weavers of the finer kinds of cloth in other parts of India, have fallen upon evil times. They are unable to compete with the showy goods which Manchester sends in such profusion, and they have of late years emigrated in great numbers, chiefly to Berar, whereas day laborers they are able to obtain wages. And it is again census report of central provinces 1872, quoted in Sumit Guha, the handloom industry in central India 1825 to 1950. So it's the description of the period between 1825 and 1950, the Indian Economic and Social History Review. So in this report, Sumit Guha clearly mentioned here, and again here also we see that the weavers in the central provinces were unable to compete with the showy goods of Manchester, and they were presented in such a great manner, in a very beautiful manner, that the products of Indian weavers were unable to attract the local people, and people started purchasing cheap machine made goods coming from Manchester, and for the laborers it became really difficult to survive. So in both the source we have found clearly that whether the community there in Bihar or in central provinces, like we talked about Koshtis, a community of weavers, found it really difficult to survive because of the products coming from Manchester, or we can say products coming from England. Now let's think and find out with the statement mentioned here by a company official, means the officer of English East India Company. So in 1772, Henry Patullo, a company official, had ventured to say that the demand for Indian textiles could never reduce, since no other nation produced goods of the same quality. So he said in 1772, the dates are important here. So in 1772, he remarked that since the quality of Indian products is really good, and hence its demand in the international market, and when we are talking about international market here for Indian product, it was majorly England here. So the demand would never reduce. It cannot reduce since no other countries or nations produced goods of the same quality. So the quality of Indian products is extremely good, and hence the demand would never reduce. But his statement with time failed. How? Let's see here with the data. Yet the beginning of the 19th century, we see the beginning of a long decline of textile exports from India in 1811-12. Piece goods accounted for 33% of India's exports. By 1850-51, it was no more than 3%. So it's a matter to think and find out, why did this happen? What were its implications? So at one hand, we see the statement of 1772 what Henry Patullo said, that the demands would never reduce because of the great quality of Indian products. On the other hand, if we see the data from the beginning of 19th century, in the beginning of the 19th century, we were exporting nearly 33% of cotton piece goods. But by 1850-51, it was no more than 3%. So a great decline. Let's find out why this happened and how this happened. At first, we will talk about the mechanism by which Manchester was established. So Manchester started production. It was the first industrialized city of England, and it is well known for its cotton industry. So how it was established, how it was promoted, what was the mechanism for that? Before understanding this, as Manchester is well known for its cotton industry, you should know. So at first, it's very important to understand what was the international market and what was the local market. So for England, international market was India. Here in this relation we'll study, and the local market, of course, their own country, England. And just opposite for India, international market was England and the local market was India. Now the mechanism, if we talk about mechanism, it's the tax on imports. This is extremely important to understand. Tax on imports acts as a trade barrier or trade regulator. Like regulator is used to increase or decrease something. So similarly, tax on imports is the most important example for the trade barrier. Other trade barriers are government restrictions. However, this tax on import plays extremely important role in controlling the trade, or they act as trade barrier. If something has to be stopped or something has to be regulated, I mean the trade, that could be done with the help of tax on imports. So you can see here this diagram, this one and this one. So let's say you want a particular product to come to your country, India, I mean to be imported. If you want more import, right? So then what would be the case? And if you want less import, then what could be the case? How it is regulated by tax on imports? So consider this situation. When you increase in taxes on imports, so whenever there would be an increase in taxes on imports, there would be decrease in imports because the profitability would be reduced, right? So if there would be more taxes, when the product would come to the country, the prices would be extremely high. So in this way, any product's entry or import could be controlled. So very simply, when you increase taxes on imports, the quantity would automatically be decreased. On the other hand, when you reduce taxes, okay, when the taxes on imports would be quite less, then more and more product would start flooding into the country, right? And this particular topic you would study in economics as well, in globalization, this tax on import. So understand it very clearly that tax on imports acts as a trade barrier or trade regulator. So decrease the taxes, more products would come. Increase the taxes, less product would come, right? Increase, decrease in imports, reduce the taxes, increase in imports. Clear? So it's an inverse relationship here. So you can see here, I hope you understood the mechanism. This was the mechanism. Now, as we understood the mechanism, how this mechanism was implemented, what were the steps taken by England to strengthen Manchester? So industries were established in Manchester. So how Manchester got the support to expand its product, to expand its business worldwide. Understand it. As cotton industries developed in England, industrial groups began worrying about imports from other countries because the products were coming from other countries like India. So Manchester wanted kind of monopoly that only Manchester products could be sold in the country. So in this way, Manchester wanted to capture the local market of England's market. So they were worried, industrial groups were worried that till the time the imports would continue, it would be difficult for Manchester to hold its position to sell the products in the country. So what they did, they pressurized the government to impose import duties on cotton textiles so that Manchester goods could sell in Britain without facing any competition from outside. So simply Manchester groups or all the industrial groups, industrialists, they approached the government and said the government to impose import duties. Duties means taxes. So tax on import. So they wanted tax on import for the products coming from countries like India to control all the imports. And when the import would be regulated, it was very clear that the option for the local market would be to purchase products from coming from Manchester or the Manchester goods. They wanted to remove or eliminate competition. At the same time, industrialists persuaded means convinced the East India Company. So they had this advantage that East India Company, English East India Company, was ruling over India. So these industrialists convinced the East India Company to sell British manufactures or the British products in Indian market as well. Got it? So two ways. They wanted to increase the tax on import in England so that Indian products would or the product coming from other countries would stop and Manchester would not have to face any competition from outside, and at the same time they pressurized or persuaded or convinced the East India Company to sell British products in Indian market to get the international market very clearly. Exports of British cotton goods increased dramatically in the early 19th century. And hence, so what British government did, they increased taxes on imports in England, and eventually the products stopped coming to England. No competition for Manchester, and Manchester captured the local market of England. And also East India Company, what East India Company did, increased the decreased the taxes on import in India. So since the taxes on import in India reduced, more and more products from Manchester started flooding in the Indian market, and hence this exports of British cotton goods increased dramatically in the early 19th century. At the end of the 18th century, there had been virtually no import of cotton piece goods into India. So, as we are talking about 18th century, there were no imports. We were not importing any cotton clothes from England. No imports in India. But the situation changed as we discussed in the as per the statement earlier. But by 1850, mid 19th century, cotton piece goods constituted over 31% of the value of Indian imports. Imagine. So virtually no imports to 31% of the value of Indian imports, and by the 1870s this figure was over 50%. So the figure was over 50% by 1870s. So the whole scenario changed. Let's understand and gather the keywords for the establishment of dominance of Manchester over its local and international market. So all the keywords are here. So how Manchester started dominating local market as well as international market. So the first thing, introduction of cotton industries. Cotton industries started in Manchester as we discussed. Thereafter, they pressurized on government for protection from imports that we discussed. Imposition of trade barriers in England. So they put trade barriers in England, increased the taxes on imports in England, and hence the products coming from outside, from India, stopped coming to, or reduced to a great extent, coming to England, and Manchester captured the local market. Another thing, persuading EEIC, English East India Company, to sell Manchester products in India. And for that, East India Company decreased the taxes on imports in India, and Manchester products started flooding to the Indian market. Thereafter, removal of trade barriers in India, as we have discussed. So trade barriers removed in India, and thereafter the products flooded the Indian market, and thus increased exports of British cotton goods. So all the British cotton goods started getting exported from Britain to India. So in this way, with all these keywords, we can understand clearly how Manchester became dominant, how Manchester established its control, dominance over its local as well as international market. So all these keywords you would need to explain. Now let's understand the impact of advent of, means coming of, Manchester goods in India. So we understood how Manchester captured its local and international market, and what became the impact of it on India. That's very important to understand. Cotton weavers in India thus face two problems at the same time. Their export market collapsed because of the trade barrier. So the export market was collapsed, and the local market also shrank, being glutted with Manchester imports. Since Manchester products came to India, so both the things happened. Their export market already collapsed, and they were not even able to get the business from the local market, that is within the country. Produced by machines at lower costs, the imported cotton goods were so cheap that weavers could not easily compete with them. By the 1850s, reports from most weaving regions of India narrated stories of decline and desolation. So of course, the Indian weavers were unable to compete with the cheap machine-made goods coming from Manchester, and hence the business, the trade, the weaving work in India started declining, and it became desolation, everything got deserted. So by the 1860s, weavers faced a new problem. They could not get sufficient supply of raw cotton of good quality. Now another problem emerged, that they were not able to get raw material as well of good quality. The reason is, when the American Civil War broke out and cotton supplies from the US were cut off, Britain turned to India. As raw cotton exports from India increase, the price of raw cotton shot up. So previously, Britain was getting raw cotton from England itself as well as from United States, from America. But after 1860s in America, there happened to have the Civil War, and because of the Civil War, the cotton supplies from US were cut off. So Britain was not getting cotton supplies, raw cotton, which they wanted to produce the cotton piece clothes, and hence Britain started getting the raw cotton from India. And when Britain started getting raw cotton from India, the prices of raw cotton increased and the local weavers were unable to purchase the raw cotton, now good quality raw cotton, because the prices were extremely high. Weavers in India were starved of supplies and forced to buy raw cotton at exorbitant prices, means very high prices. That was the only option. In this situation, weaving could not pay. Of course, if they would purchase the raw cotton at very high prices, the prices of the clothes would be high, and eventually, because of the Manchester products, they were not able to hold the market, to get business from the market. So in this situation, weaving became really difficult for the weavers. Then by the end of the 19th century, weavers and other craftspeople posed yet another problem. Factories in India began production, flooding the market with machine goods, and that was another problem. By this time, we have seen that things were coming from Manchester, okay, and thereafter, Indian industries were also set up, and these Indian industries also started flooding the market with machine-made goods. Now let's summarize the description with the keywords here. Problems faced by the weavers after Manchester imports in India. What we discussed, I have put it in this flowchart and the mind map, so understand it. So what were the new problems faced by the weavers? Flood of Manchester products, which collapsed export market and shrink the local market. Unable to compete with cheap machine-made goods, so Indian weavers were unable to compete with cheap machine-made goods, as we discussed. Shortage of good quality raw materials by 1860s. There has been shortage of raw material, as we discussed, because of the American Civil War, and exorbitant prices of raw cotton due to American Civil War. Very high prices of raw cotton. Machine-made products in Indian industries flooded the market. And the next problem is that Indian industries also started producing goods, cotton products, and those products flooded the Indian market. So we have understood how Manchester captured its local market as well as international market, and viewers face several problems. So we have the assignment here. Analyze how Manchester captured Indian market. The keywords are already there, the descriptions are there. You need to make a note of it. Discuss the problems faced by the weavers after Manchester imports in India. What were the problems faced by the weavers? Now the next is, what did the industrial groups of Manchester demand to secure their position? What did they demand? What did they demand with the government, and what did they persuade English East India Company? How far did the government consider their demands? Of course, the government considered their demands, and what has happened we discussed. You need to write it. Thank you and have a great day.